My name is Christopher Taylor. I run a small business I call Sovereign Harmony, and I'm gonna just get this on the slideshow here. All right, so now we're ready to go. All right, so like I said, Christopher Taylor with Sovereign Harmony, and so I've been doing readings, astrological readings, and writings and things like that for a long time now. And this is just something I'm putting together here on October 27th, 1 week before the US election in 2020. We will touch on some of that later in this, and you'll see how things kind of fit in with the election itself. And the title here is From Hierarchy to Sovereignty, and it's the Great Power Transition. Lots of people are familiar with the idea of transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. This is related to that kind of concept. It just so happens to be the movement of the fixed star Regulus from the tropical zodiac Leo into Virgo right around the same time of this shift from Pisces to Aquarius. And we'll talk about the Pisces to Aquarius as it comes up too. And it's just interesting. They're both about a 2,000-year period, and they're both coinciding, that shift is coinciding around the same time. And I've done a couple videos specifically about Regulus having to do with the shift in consciousness. And I've done videos on what I call the power generations, which we're going to review here pretty enough that you're going to understand it, even if you didn't see that first one. So I'm kind of combining some of the old stuff I've done with some new stuff. And so if you've seen some of my other videos, then some of this will look familiar, but it's all going to make sense. So we'll move into it. So that's me. I was born Sun in Pisces, Moon in Virgo. Is actually a lunar eclipse. So if you are into astrology, you might get already a glimpse or a sense of what energy I bring with the big picture, mending with the small picture. And I try to do that as much as I can to put things in perspective. My background real quick, as far as schooling went, way back, I was in energy and sustainability. My first degree was in meteorology. I went on to atmospheric science and focused on climate change and environmental science for the most part. And my upbringing was very, what you would call left brain, normal, East Coast, Massachusetts. So it wasn't like I was introduced to any kind of topics like this astrologically or anything like that. So this is something I came into on my own over time. And so I've been involved in this in 12 plus years. I mean, a little bit longer than that, but as far as a professional in astrology, it's been about 12 years. 2008 was when I started. And I've always been very interested in the mundane aspects of astrology. If you're not familiar with that means, that is the part of astrology that deals with the bigger picture and how that fits in. So we'll move on from there. This will let me go. Here we go. So anyway, what we're going to cover today, I'm going to try to do this in about an hour. It might take a little longer, but we'll see how it goes. Like I said, the big picture, this shift of Regulus from Leo into Virgo, I'm going to get into that here in a couple of slides, the specifics of that, what that means. Also, Pluto and Capricorn, another big picture situation that is currently happening. And then we're going to talk about the current players, and that's individuals as well as generations of people in their role in this shift in what we see as power and leadership and whatnot. And then a little bit about what we can expect in the future in this battle between what I'm calling the old guard and the new reality. And so the old guard is the energy still related to Regulus and Leo, whereas the new reality is going to be this Regulus and Virgo energy. And also talking about the media, a little slight history of the media and where they fit in and how that's kind of crumbling as we speak. And also a little bit about the timing and the potential speed of this transition. And that's where this election can come into play in some ways, not that this shift is impeded in any way by whoever wins an election. That's a very small scale thing compared to this larger scale stuff, but we'll just see how that plays out. So specifics about Regulus. Most people have not heard of it. It's a fixed star. That means that it's not really moving through the zodiac like the planets are, but because of the precession of equinoxes, if you're not familiar with that, there's kind of a rotation every 2,000 years per sign, so roughly about 23,000 years is one precession. And so the fixed stars, in this case Regulus, will be in each for, each sign for about 2,000 years. So if that moves up again, 2167, that's the exact amount of years, so roughly 2,000, but a little bit more. And it was back in November of 2011, that's when Regulus actually made that transition into Virgo. Now, it's not like big things happened right away, and I didn't expect that, and we're going to talk about that too. But it is when the rumble started to come in, where this structure of Regulus and Leo, which in the next slide we'll talk about what that is and how it compares, started to break down, and this new way of organizing power started to come in. And that's that picture again, and we'll go to that next slide. So this is a slide where we can really look at the two different types of power structure. One being Regulus in Leo, which is very hierarchical, and that's the title of this talk here. We're coming from this sense of hierarchy. Now, this started right around the Roman Empire, and so you're talking about the entire structure of power, which has been pretty much all about empires since then, right? Where there's kind of rulership over many from very small amounts of people. So we had Roman Empire, we had an Ottoman Empire, we had British Empire. I mean, we could consider right now the American Empire in some ways, so it's just been empire after empire. But that is what's really breaking down, in that in what Virgo really represents in its purity is the pieces. It's the small parts that make up the whole. It's like the pieces of the puzzle, not the puzzle itself, not the picture that's painted by the finished puzzle itself. And so power structures itself much differently under a Virgo energy. And so it's going to be a lot less on a couple of people's shoulders for the masses, and more about spreading that power into each individual piece, a sovereign kind of expression of power. So one thing we can see here is we experience a very imbalanced relationship between the masculine and feminine with Regulus and Leo, and the structure of it generally is a very harsh kind of masculine up top down to the feminine in that control mechanism. And Virgo is an energy that is much more balanced. I mean, it's a feminine energy in itself, and it's much less about ego, much more about service. Okay. Another thing, like I just said, the central hierarchy of authority. So this is where things like collectivism come in. Now, collectivism, you don't really hear that term too often. You hear terms like fascism and socialism, communism. All of those are forms of collectivism. Okay, and we notice. I just put a little note here that Regulus has been in Leo for over 2,100 years, and it entered the 29th degree of Leo in recent times, about the 1930s, right up until it shifted into Virgo in 2011. So that whole period of time is when Regulus was what's I consider the critical degree of Leo. So when all that expression of Leo was at its height, right? And notice pretty much everyone alive on the planet right now, with the exception of 7-year-olds, or I guess that's 9-year-olds if we're doing the math here, or younger, or people that are well into their 80s and whatnot. And so most people, in other words, were born with not only Regulus in Leo, but at the 29th degree. And so there's a lot of energy left in the human beings on the planet. And so that's one of the reasons why it doesn't go away really quickly. And I put this little cell phone image here because I think of it like a cell phone charge. Think of it as, the cell phone was charged, and when we hit 2011, it was charged with Regulus and Leo energy. There's still some charge left. And so there's still some charge left over that's moving through these years. Okay, but it is running out, and there's nowhere to plug it back in. It can only plug into the Regulus and Virgo energy if it wants to recharge. Okay, and so you can think of it as a cell phone running out of charge. And so there's still some left. It still works. It hasn't died yet. And that's why we still see a lot of this Regulus and Leo energy, but it's in a rapid breakdown mode right now, as we'll talk about. So Virgo, again, is going to be more about decentralization of authority in the pieces rather than that collectivism, rather than communism, fascism, which are really the same thing. Really, we could think of fascism as obvious, in-your-face, toxic, masculine, breaking down your front door with authority, whereas communism or socialism, which gets you there, is essentially what I call backdoor collectivism. That's where there's a young girl with Girl Scout cookies knocking on the back door. You opened up the door, you even let her in because you let down your guard, and then you get the same result as you'd get with that, break down your door. So that's basically toxic feminism. Again, is it the imbalance between masculine and feminine? There's really no way to have a good expression of either, and that's why collectivism was born out of Regulus and Leo energy, because it's either going to go, in its most extreme. Once we hit 29 degrees Leo, what started to really rule the day was collectivism. This is when Nazi Germany rose. So you have the fascist side of it. Also, you had Mussolini in Italy. That was another fascist. But then you had Stalin and the communists in Russia. You had China becoming communist in 1949. You had the Cold War. You had, so point is that collectivism was very strong especially in that last degree of 29 degrees of Leo that we just came out of. But now here we are in 2011, it moves to Virgo, and there's still some charge left. So here 9 years later in 2020, there's still some of that collectivism, and it's desperate. It's very desperate right now. And we'll see how, it's already obvious, I'm sure, to you without me explaining it, but we'll talk about specifics as we move through here. But something else that Regulus and Neo had to do with was centralization of not only power politically, but as far as electricity and energy is generated and stored and transmitted. It's very centralized. Even within the U.S., for example, there's only 3 grids that run the entire nation. It's an East Coast grid, a West Coast grid, and then Texas has their own grid. But this could be done in a much more micro scale, which would be much more efficient. And then you'd have more opportunities for energy sources that don't work on a larger scale, but can work on a micro scale. And so we're moving into that rather rapidly as well. When it comes to medicine, Regulus and Leo is very allopathic, looking at the body like mechanical parts to treat one at a time or cut this out, surgical procedures to heal things, which isn't really healing. Whereas Regulus and Virgo is going to be individualized medicine. So it's more comprehensive and holistic and looking at the individual and their needs, not just saying this is just another human, another mechanical system. And so let's attack this mechanical system the same way we attacked the last system. And so medicine is in a total revamp. That's why you see things like healthcare as such a hot topic, because honestly, it's always been sick care. It hasn't really been healthcare. And so we're kind of at a crossroads where we're kind of, even wondering if it's even, worth keeping things the way they've been in that Regulus and Leo structure, that hierarchy. When it comes to personal power, Regulus and Leo is about projection of our personal power. What happened with 29 degrees Leo from about the 1930s to 2011 when it comes to sports or entertainment, Hollywood, politicians? Prior to television, politicians were really not revered as much as they are today. Now you have rallies, you have, like what's happening with like the Trump rallies right now is a great example of, this energy bleeding out and coming out of the system. But what happened like with the coronavirus here is it killed sports and entertainment quite a bit, right? When I talked about this a few years ago about how Regulus and Leo would see, less influence by famous people, right? Less, projection of our power to others, because that's a hierarchical structure, and that's why they get paid so much more than quote unquote regular people. Is that's our exporting our power to them, and power, comes in that form of money, that ability to do more with what you have, your resources. But sports and entertainment have both taken a hit, as well as politicians. There's a lot coming out right now about, corruption and whatnot. There's a lot coming out in Hollywood entertainment about some, like look what happened with the Weinstein and Epstein and now Maxwell and where that's all headed, and how Hollywood ties into that. So there's lots of, transition as far as how we see entertainers now, and kind of them exposing themselves or being exposed. And again, in sports is based on revenue. If there's no revenue, the players can't make that much money. And they're probably holding on to some strings right about now with coronavirus and shortened seasons and whatnot, and no fans in the stands. But that can only last for so long before salaries come down, right? And that's this move into Regulus in Virgo, a more practical way of going about the world. And and so more sovereign empowerment. And so, seeing ourselves as all we need and not having to extend or export our power to others. Another thing is seeing the entire planet as a resource extraction opportunity. That's very Regulus in Leo, and also part of the whole idea of empires, right? We're going to conquer more and more resources. It's all in whatever we can get out of it. Whereas Regulus in Virgo is about, local and regional resource management combined with more decentralized energy. You have much more efficient systems that can come out of that, and there is some sense that we are, shifting toward that more and more. And then the last part is just the ideological aspect of, with Regulus and Leo, it's what is our value relative to our usefulness to the state alone versus what is our value as an individual. And so this increase in individual value, sovereign empowerment, and moving away from exporting our power and seeing, our only usefulness as what we can do for that collective state, be it fascist, communist, socialist, whatever. Those are not systems that are necessary anymore. So what does it mean, generally speaking? Well, and we'll get back to this. It's really a goodbye to that hierarchy, pyramid, guru, leader structure. Whether it's a sports person, a politician, entertainer, they become a guru. Even different practices that are based on gurus are falling apart. There's been quite a bit in the last 10 years of so-called gurus in doing spiritual retreats and whatnot, getting busted for basically like, sexual misconduct and things of that nature. And so we're just kind of realizing that we don't need this guy anymore to be following something, because again, it's personal empowerment, sovereign empowerment. And some things that arose at the very end of Regulus and Leo, just as an example, are things like multi-level marketing. It's very pyramid-like. Sure, it isn't technically a pyramid scheme, but because there is a product, but it's very much Regulus and Leo structure. And those all popped up right before Regulus entered Virgo in 2011, and they're still trying to hang on again until that cell phone charge runs out. Even things like coaching, I see, if you're not actually offering a service and you're just offering to basically help others with their service, it's a bit of a parasitic, almost government-like role, right? Where you're not doing much other than supposedly providing either protection or help or whatever in exchange for your funds. And it's a kind of relationship that's dying here in Regulus and Virgo, which is why we're going to see, I think, big changes in our political structure and how governments run and whatnot. And that's why they're getting shooken up so much right now, is because that charge is running out. It's running out fast. And so we'll see more balance in that masculine and feminine, more balance between our own authority and our inner child. And that's really comes down to, instead of exporting our authority to governments and whatnot, and becoming this eternal adolescent, which is really the whole intention of like communism, for example, is to create eternal dependency and like extended adolescence. We always need the authority to take care of you. And so when we balance that within ourselves, and we have a sense of sovereignty within ourselves, then we stop exporting our authority and we claim it more. And so that's part of the new paradigm as well. And so we're really transitioning from what was separation consciousness, so this belief or this foundational ideology that we are separate beings and we have to depend. So there's that codependence. Whereas connection conscious, we're heading into, where if we are fully connected and sovereign, then we're whole and we have actually more to offer others from that position. Okay, and so so we're going to get back to Regulus in Virgo versus Leo, but that gives you a good overview of the drastic difference that there is, and you're probably already thinking of ways that this is showing up here in the world. I gave some examples, but I'm sure you can think of others as well. The 2020s, at the beginning of 2020, December 2019, I put together some slides, and this slide is right off of that talk there. And I was looking ahead at 2020, and I was like, man, this is going to be a very intense year. I don't know exactly why, but it feels very heavy, feels very like it's going to set a precedence for the next several decades. And especially in 2020 itself, It's going to start off this decade quite strongly, and it didn't disappoint as far as that expectation. Although, if you're expecting harsh, it doesn't make the harsh any less. And of course, we all know what happened here in the start of 2020 on a global scale, especially when it comes to all things Capricorn. Capricorn being government and how we organize power in some ways. And we started out the year in January with the Pluto Saturn conjunction, and then Jupiter and Pluto have been conjunct each other since about March, and it's going to finish up here on the winter solstice, just less than 2 months from now, just before Christmas, where with Jupiter and Saturn are going to link up, and they're actually going to be within 1 degree of each other at the last degree of Capricorn, and then cross over to Aquarius. Very symbolic transition at that point, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But point being is all 3 of these haven't been in Capricorn at the same time. The last time was actually in the early 1500s, and this was during the Protestant Reformation in Europe that spread quite rapidly. And you went from the Catholic Church for over 1,500 years being, the dominant power structure. And what happened, and of course, this all happened with Regulus and Leo. That was Regulus and Leo time. And this comes in, this energy comes in, and it all just crumbles down, and it's broken down into pieces, what we now call, Protestant, those different Protestant names, denominations or whatever. Couldn't get the word out of my head. But yeah, and that's actually the dominant religion or religion expression in the US actually is Protestants. There's, all different kinds of Protestants, but the fact that Christianity broke up into those pieces could never happen. That could never happen. And from the perspective of someone in the year 1400, if you said 100 years from now, it's all going to break up into pieces, we said, no way, never going to happen. But it did. And so we're in another one of these times where, things are happening. Pluto has been in Capricorn since 2008. And this 16-year period is very significant. We're going to talk about that a little later as well. That 16-year period of Pluto and Capricorn is extremely important, especially in the United States. Okay, but I want to focus here because I'm going to transition this to those power generations that I mentioned, and then we'll get back to how it all ties together. So I've highlighted the evolutionary planets. It's just kind of a list of the planets. We have the Sun and Moon are considered the lights. Mercury, Venus, and Mars are our personal planets. Jupiter and Saturn represent the cultural planets, and the evolutionary planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, these are the ones that have more to do with kind of where society, where a greater society is evolving toward. Okay, and these are the 3 planets that matter as far as what I talk about these power generations. So Pluto, if you're not familiar, deals with power, suffering and loss, rising from the ashes, everything that that has to do with that. So dying and being reborn, basically regenerating, and it rules Scorpio. Okay, and Scorpio is an important sign when it comes to these power generations because it has to do with power and transformation. And right now, like I said, Pluto is in Capricorn since 2008, and it's going to be entering Aquarius around the middle of this decade coming up. So we won't get too much into that until later, but just note that it doesn't change signs very often, a lot more often than Regulus, but not very often in a human lifetime perspective. And the last time Pluto was in Aquarius was actually 1778 to 1794. And what's interesting about that is when the Declaration of Independence was signed in the US, that was in 1776. It was at the tail end of Pluto and Capricorn, which is what we are approaching here in the next couple of years. Okay, so we have what's going to be the Pluto return for the United States. It's going to be very significant, and we'll talk about that as well as we move along. But what happened here was Aquarian energy, which has a lot to do with really if you look at the Constitution of the United States, it's very Aquarian in its essence, in that it's all about personal freedom and the idea of everyone having a voice and equal, that kind of thing is very Aquarian. Okay, and so when Pluto went through Aquarius, it was this American Revolution was going on, right? And so that's the kind of energy we're coming up with again, but it's not necessarily in America this time around. Okay, so we'll see where that might play itself out perhaps the Hong Kong revolution, what's going on in China, right before the coronavirus came out, there's a lot of people in China, especially Hong Kong, that are done with the Communist Party. And, who knows, maybe in a couple of years, we'll be looking at that, equivalence of an American revolution, essentially, in China. You never know, because that Communist Party energy is very Regulus in Leo, and it's not going to hold up too much longer. Okay. Neptune is the other one of those evolutionary planets. It rules Pisces, and it has to do with intuition, subtle energy. It's the energy of like mystical things. On the negative side, it can be escapism and drugs and whatnot, but it's generally considered the spiritual energy. It's the spiritualization or the dissolution. It's kind of it's a dissolver. Wherever it touches, it's going to dissolve. And Neptune is in Pisces right now. It's home. That's where it rules, and it's been there since 2011. And it's not going to leave till about middle of the decade. So notice Pluto and now Neptune are both going to be shifting here about the same time, the middle of the decade. And its last time that it was in Aries, which is where it will be next, is 1861 to 1875. And so we just think about American history once again. This is the transition from Pisces to Aries with Neptune was essentially the start of the Civil War. That doesn't mean the Civil War is coming again, but it's the same energy, and we haven't had it since then. Okay. Uranus, the last planet of the evolutionary planets, that rules the sign of Aquarius. And so we think age of Aquarius, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to see how that plays out. Like I said, this has to do with, inspiration, lightning insights, unique creativity, also rebellion. It's very much about the unknown. It's the planet of surprise, what you least expect. And it's that part of ourselves that, can surprise us as well. And for that, same thing, middle of the decade, it will be transitioning signs. Right now it's in Taurus. It just got there a couple years ago, but it's going to last there about 7 years or so. And it's just interesting that all three of the evolutionary planets are crossing the threshold into a new sign within about a year and a half of each other from 2024 to 2026 or so. And that's interesting because that's also, if you think about the US, it's whoever is going to be the next president, not the president here from 2021 to 2024, but whoever is going to be the next one, because there would have to be a next one at that point. We're going to be shifting into something brand new. Maybe it might be new forms of how we govern, and who knows by then. But this is a good time for a major shift. Last time that Uranus was going to be in Gemini, which is where it will be again, not yet, but that was in the early 1940s, basically the whole 1940s. And so this was the beginning half of World War II. Again, not necessarily going to have World War, but the idea being that this is the energy. We're kind of all the heaviest times of American history are coming together at once, right? And that's how you get rid of things. That's how you process things, right? You don't repeat them, but that's how you process things, is just like that. So the energy of Scorpio, like I said, is very, very important for this idea of power generation, which really spans from the mid 1960s right on through the mid 1990s, plus or minus. And there's a few nodes there. One is right at the beginning there, mid to late 60s. Another one is in the late 70s, early 80s. And then the final one was in the early to mid 90s. But again, it encompasses that entire period. And there's your planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so Scorpio comes in because in all of these situations, it represents the capacity to influence, that power. And one of these planets is going to be in Scorpio for that node, and that node. And so you'll see that here. So that first group, which is going to be that mid to late 60s group, what you see here is the wheel. Here's the sign of Scorpio is right there. And you're going to see one of these three planets there for each of these generations. So current age for this generation, or this part of the power generation, is the late 40s to mid 50s. So coming into positions of power at this point. Neptune was in Scorpio for that group, and Pluto and Uranus were actually conjunct in Virgo, 2 signs away. What you're going to notice as we move through the next 2 generations is that Pluto and Neptune stay about 2 signs away. They're moving about the same speed, so they're always about 2 signs away from each other, whereas Uranus is really our planet that indicates the shift in those nodes of the power generation. The entire power generation is a time when Uranus hit Pluto in Virgo, and at the last part of it will be when it hits Neptune, and they'll be up in Capricorn at that time. But this generation is often known as Gen X, okay? And it's the initiation of societal transformation is really what that represented. If you think about it, that conjunction was in Virgo between Pluto and Uranus, and this is kind of a preemptive notion of Regulus transitioning into Virgo, which wouldn't happen until about more than 40 years later. But now it's happened. Now we're on the other side of that. So I call these the vessels or the organizers. They're kind of very good at organizing and having purpose and transforming resources in new ways, and they're dissolving things like taboos with sexuality and fears and things that have held us back. And that's kind of their role, that node of the power generation. But really the entire power generation, anyone born from the mid 60s to the mid 90s, is really here to be part of this transition. Okay, so the next one is going to be, notice how Pluto and Neptune are still 2 signs apart, but they both moved up a sign. But Uranus, instead of being with Pluto, is moved in between them. And so that's what really creates the energy of the second node, which is these communicators, these translators, people born in the late 70s to early 80s. And that's my age range here, late 30s to early 40s, and known as Gen Y, or they can be like kind of the lost generation. For us, it was, we're helping with transforming roles and relationships, dissolving boundaries and limits of what is considered normal, etc. And what I always say is that this is a generation that was prepared for a world that no longer existed by the time we got there. And I'll say that again, we were prepared for a world that no longer existed by the time we got there. And the reason I say that is because most of us were still adolescents prior to really the internet age, prior to the technology age. I was a kid in the early 80s, a teenager in the 90s, and my first email address was in 1997 when I went away to college. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do with this? I'm never going to use email. And 4 years later, when I graduated, I couldn't imagine going a day without checking my email. Not that I had a phone yet with it, because that didn't exist yet. You couldn't do that yet. But the idea of not checking my email on a computer was kind of odd. So things changed very quickly. So the world was different. In the final node of that the power generation here, notice Pluto again, 2 signs away from Neptune. They just moved up yet another sign, and Uranus has sped up and caught up with Neptune. And so now you have a conjunction of Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn with Pluto in Scorpio. And so we had the first node of that power generation had Neptune in Scorpio. The second one had Uranus in Scorpio, and now we have Pluto in Scorpio. So that's really what defines the boundaries for the power generation as far as I'm concerned. And we call these the Millennials, right? They're early 20s to early 30s right now, and they're full of passion. Call them the Indigos. They started popping in about the mid 80s, about 1984, when Pluto entered Scorpio. And the biggest part I want to pull out from this part of it is this radical self-accountability. And you might think to yourself, wow, people in that age group aren't very self-accountable. If you are one, or at least the reputation of millennials, right? Not very self-accountable. Right now, especially in that node in the early to mid 90s, they're starting to go through their Saturn return. If you're not familiar with Saturn return, it's at about age 29. Saturn returns to where it was when you were born. And for these folks, Saturn is hitting this conjunction between Neptune and Uranus in Capricorn, because it's in Capricorn, like we said. And it's hitting that, awakening it. They're all about to go through their Saturn return, following that up. So right now, people born in, say, 1991 are going through their Saturn returns, plus or minus. But especially the mid part of that, 92 to 95 is really the hot zone. And so it's going to be over the next 1 to 4 years or so that a lot of this part of that generation is maturing rapidly, coming into radical self-accountability. That's that Uranus and Capricorn activated by Saturn's passage, and then their Saturn return that will quickly follow here. And notice that Saturn return time for the end of the power generation, in other words, what completes this cycle where it's ready to go, is these next 4 years or so, which is the last years that Pluto is in Capricorn, that Neptune's in Pisces, and that Uranus is in Taurus before all three of them switch over to new signs. And like in the US, for example, we know we're going to have, we certainly will have new leadership at that point. And so there's like a big like incubation period we're still in right now. And these indigos, this radical self-accountability generation is going to be ready to go in the mid 2020s for the most part. And the entire 30-year period from the mid 60s to mid 90s, all those folks are going to be ready and raring to go and play their roles in this change. Following that, the power generation, so now we're not in the power generation anymore. Once Pluto exited Scorpio into Sagittarius in about 1995, it was over. That's it. Now we have a group of young people that were born with Pluto in Sag, Neptune in Aquarius, Uranus in Aquarius, especially once we get to the very late 90s into the mid 2000s or so. That's kind of the structure of their, where they come from. So Pluto in Sagittarius, very suggestible, which is another way of saying very easy to indoctrinate. Okay. And so because of that ease of indoctrination, they kind of latch on to whatever they're taught. But the flip side of that is they're able to rapidly transform their beliefs. So they can believe something very strongly in the young part of their life, and then admit to being wrong about it and believe very strongly in the opposite direction later in life, or in a new way. So that's the positive side, the flexibility of that powerful belief. And they're very heavily influenced by the power generation. Most notably, the end of that power generation, those folks that are slightly older than they are, the ones that are going to go through their Saturn return over the next few years. With the Neptune-Uranus in Aquarius connection, this again, we're talking about age of Aquarius, So these are the folks that will help bring on that vision, essentially, but they have to first go through a period of learning, essentially, how to be in the world. Right now, we see a lot of these people, unfortunately, in these kinds of groups where their heart's in the right place. It feels like they're taken down, it almost seems like they are part of ripping down Regulus in Leo, when in fact, they're being led and controlled by those people at the top of the pyramid that are still part of that Regulus in Leo that's trying to hang on. Okay, so yes, everybody is anti-fascist, but anti-fascism and pro-communism are kind of one and the same. And again, it's either they're basically against front door collectivism, but they're all for backdoor collectivism, the Girl Scout cookies from the back door. And the idea is getting out of this mindset. Again, that Pluto in Sagittarius is very strong, and they will. I'm very confident that they feel strongly about what they feel, and they think they know who the enemy is, even though the enemy is using them right now. If you ever were familiar with communist Russia, what both Lenin and Stalin referred to, the people that helped them create the revolution, because they couldn't do it themselves. They needed a mob of people that were for the cause to overthrow the Tsar at the time and whatever, and bring in communism. And they were known by Lenin and Stalin as their useful idiots. Not my term, their term, but a Russian word, whatever it was in Russian, but useful idiots is what it translates to in English. And what it meant was, yeah, they're helpful to tear things down, but once things are put back up in that communist structure, in that case, these are the first people that were executed. They're the first people that they got rid of and tried, because they were troublemakers. Okay, they're useful while they're useful, but then they're troublemakers. But I really feel like with the if we go back here, this radical self-accountability for those folks slightly older than the folks we were just talking about, they're going through their Saturn return the next few years. I really feel like there's going to be a radical transition in global worldview as far as power goes. And then it's going to have to be, because when we get into the mid-20s, when Uranus enters Gemini, Neptune enters Aries, and Pluto enters Aquarius, again, because they all enter within about a year and a half of each other, the people being born at that time, this energy is very, very, it's like I can't live in the old world, okay? So whereas the power generation is capable of living in both worlds, with our feet in both worlds as a transition happens, those folks that are going to be born at this time really need a world that can work. Let's put it this way: they're going to be very susceptible to top-down influences if those top-down influences exist still. I think they're going to get torn down pretty quickly before that happens. But the idea being is that if there was a communist structure set up, let's say a globalist communist structure, these folks wouldn't know any better, and they would be easy to be used for their energy and whatnot. Whereas they'll also thrive in a world that's individualized, with the Regulus in Virgo framework of individualization and sovereignty. They can really thrive in that, and also disillusion of things like war, right? They can really help with that kind of energy. But they need some help. They need the structure to be set up for them. And that's what the power generation is here to do, to set up that structure for that generation that comes in. We just do have an issue with the current power hierarchy using folks, younger folks, in their energy, their great energy that's going to be useful for positive things later. But they're getting used for that now. Just some examples of some people born in the later part of the power generation coming into like office. Joe Collins is someone that he's running for a district in Los Angeles. This is the district that Maxine Waters has held for like 40 something years, and nothing has happened there. She lives in a mansion. That district's fallen to pieces. So here, this individual comes in and says, I'm gonna run for that position. And notice he's born in 1985, so he's right in the pack of the power generation, kind of in between the second node and the third node, essentially. And so he's coming in and he's got good ideas, and he's going to hopefully, that'd be great if he won. I doubt it, but it'd be great if he did. The point is people are coming in. Kim Klacik is, she's been making waves here in Baltimore. It's a district in Baltimore, Maryland, where she's running for the similar reasons. The district is falling apart. It's been run the same way for decades, and nothing is actually happening to improve anyone's lives. So, here we are coming in to break down all those career politicians, that very Regulus in Leo, just like, taking money for a public servant position when you really shouldn't be getting rich doing that. And I threw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in there because she does fall into the generation, and she is in the House of Representatives now since 2018, so for a couple of years. And she is someone that I really think, like I mentioned before, with the rapid self-accountability, is, she has obviously been, whereas these two were kind of self-promoted. They weren't, put forth by any special interest groups. If anything, the special interest groups are trying to keep people like them out and to keep, the career politicians in. Whereas a special interest group known as Justice Democrats, which is, if you look into it, really has much less to do with justice and democracy, and more to do with a socialist agenda, essentially. And they pretty much latched on to her and some others and kind of created her. And she was selected almost like a real world candidate, like for a reality show. So it wasn't like this was someone aspiring to take a position. It was more like there is a position open that is weak and could be taken by someone if we have the right person. And so they selected her as their right person to run for their special interest, and she won. And that's good for her, on a personal level. But you can tell, she is kind of running on the ideas of others, not so much her own. And that's, this is a great quote from Carl Jung: people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And I really feel strongly about that. I think she's going to turn, with the rapid self-accountability, she's going to see things the way they really are. She got kind of thrown in there with no experience, no idea what was going on, told, oh, here's the people that are the problem. And she's kind of half right, but not really seeing the big picture of what really causes the problem. Talking about the US in general, like we said, the Pluto was, this is a chart of the United States. Okay. So July 4th, 1776, this is what's known as a Sibley chart. It's widely known as around 5:10 p.m. in Philadelphia that the Declaration of Independence was signed. And this Pluto was at 27 degrees Capricorn. Right now, it's a little bit before that. It's going to be coming to 27 degrees Capricorn again in 2022, 2023. So right in the middle of this next presidency, whoever it is, right? So whoever is going to be president 2021 to 2024, we're going to have our Pluto return. It's significant because what it represents is a time of either total transformation or total destruction. And there's kind of no in between. Pluto's very, very extreme and positive or negative. And so which direction is it going to go? And that's something that remains to be seen. Another just another side note, just to understand like the timing of this. So Pluto was here when the U.S. was signed into being, and it traveled all the way up and around the zodiac, and then in September 2001 it crossed the ascendant. So for the first and only time that that Pluto crossed the ascendant on the US chart, it was in September 2001. We all know what happened then. So the point being, when Pluto crosses your ascendant in a natal chart or something like that, that is going to be a very transformational time for that entity. So in this case, it's the US. The US has really never been the same on the world stage since 9/11. It kind of changed everything. Okay, it's just to give you a sense of how this chart works in the US. But going back to the idea of the Pluto return, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but notice what also started in 1776 within a couple of months of this, which means Pluto wouldn't have been very, very far off, about maybe a quarter of a degree. So essentially in the same spot when the Declaration was signed. We have the start of the Bavarian Illuminati in Eastern Europe. This was Adam Weishaupt, and if you haven't looked at the history, we're not going to go deep into that. But the point being is that's an organization that really sought to infiltrate different entities like the United States, and they've been in an attempt and somewhat successful in doing that, on a global scale, getting into different activities, starting wars, etc. But the point is that's up for total transformation and destruction during this time as well. It's kind of like we have, again, the battle of the old guard and what can be the new reality if everything goes well. So just a reminder of Regulus switching over. And so here's where we're going to get specific about the election here and the players in the election. I'm not going to go over each person's chart in depth or anything like that, but the idea being that, remember, Regulus switched over from Leo to Virgo, and that's something that happens once every 2167 years in this case. And what I found, what was very interesting about 2016, when Hillary was supposed to win, I mean, everyone thought she was going to win, and somehow Trump won, right? And when we look at Trump's chart, just to pull it up, we got his chart here. He has at his ascendant, his rising sign, a very important part, is at 29 degrees Leo, which is where his Regulus isn't going to show up here. It doesn't show up in the charts. But his Regulus, like your Regulus and my Regulus, if we're born between the 1930s and 2011, is at 29 degrees Leo. And so here's a person. This is basically the transition energy from Regulus to Leo. Not only is that just kind of set up there in his natal chart, but when we look at the sun, which I'll go back to, the sun right there was in Gemini when he was born. If we progress the sun, it goes about 1 degree per year. What happened in 2016 was very interesting, because that progressed sun actually crossed his ascendant, so from 29 degrees, at 29 degrees Leo, in July of 2016, so just before he got elected president. It's very significant. If you actually get a progressed sun across your ascendant in your lifetime, it's only going to happen to maybe one third or less, maybe 25 to 30% of people will get that to happen at some point in their life. And sometimes it happens super early in life, so you're not old enough for it to be significant. But this was going to be a very significant time in his life. So if we're just looking at it relative to that, and so that transition of that progressed sun from Leo to Virgo also happened right around the time he got elected. So just something to note there, that the energy of the current president, who wasn't supposed to be president, matches that transition. And when you understand that we're talking about the transition of the old breaking up, and we have basically a president who went in as a Republican, which I don't think it even mattered because he wasn't really representative of either one of the political structures. And he kind of shown a mirror to the Republican Party and kind of showed how corrupt they were, and he rose to the top. And then ever since then, he's been shining a mirror to the Democrat side of the aisle and showing who's corrupt there, and really just revealing. It's like his role is just to reveal all that Regulus and Leo energy we're ready to get rid of. It's not like he's coming in to do anything toward the new reality, but we need someone to come in and show everyone, essentially, if we just look at it objectively, show everyone what needs to be discarded. And like, you hear terms like drain the swamp and whatnot. And in many cases, energetically, it looks like that might be his role. And so it's like, there's a positive end to that story if you're not comfortable with the current situation, because he's got a role and he's playing it pretty well. One little like astrological note to talk about. This will transition us into the idea of the media. Okay. And so Trump is not shy about talking about the media. And, in 2015, before this individual even thought about running, I mean, I was well aware of the media and its history and its real intentions and everything else. Like probably by about 2011, 2012, I was diving pretty deep into that. And so it wasn't like when I first heard the idea of fake news, I just thought, wow, that's interesting that a politician or someone that's now a politician is actually going to say that out loud, because it was always known. But the media has been kind of confiscated for global special interest. In other words, the old Regulus and Leo energy that's breaking down. And what happened with regards to communication, which is where the media falls in, is we have what's called Venus occultations that happen once every 120 years or so. And they represent shifts in human consciousness, very big events. And they happen in pairs. So it'll happen in a certain year, and then 8 years later, it'll happen again, pretty much almost on the same date. And so the most recent two that we had were December 1874, and then 8 years later, December 1882, and then it didn't happen again until the next window of June 2004 to June 2012, I should say. And so think of it as a window, an 8-year window opening up where Venus is in Gemini in both cases, and it has to do with connectivity and connection consciousness. So it's like this rapid advancement in communication in how we communicate. Just think what life was like communication-wise prior to 1874 versus what it was like after 1882. There's a couple of things that really happened really rapidly over that period. One was just the invention of the telephone. Another one was like electricity and like large-scale deployment of that. And so all that has to do with connectivity. So you went from like say in 1865, right before this window, where if you wanted to communicate with someone, it required sending a letter that might get to them in 3 months, and then you might get a response 6 months later. Whereas by the time we were in 1885, 1890, assuming you had a line on either end, you could talk to someone 2,000 miles away in an instant. And so that was a drastic increase in technological capability for communication that happened there. And the one that happened most recently, which is the one that really has to do with where we are now, is the one where prior to 2004, yeah, we had the internet, yeah, we had cell phones, but we did not have smartphones, and we did not have social media as we have it today, as we know it today. In fact, it was in 2004 that Facebook, I think, came into being, and all other social media kind of followed from there. But the idea being is before this period, you had all the technology that was advanced here, so you could always talk to anyone at any time, right, from any point in the world. But there were still some limitations. By the time we got over here, the other side of June 2012, it was theoretically possible for anyone. You don't have to be someone on the top of the pyramid, but anyone to reach everyone at one time, right? Because you could theoretically, there's probably not enough bandwidth for it, but theoretically, you could do a YouTube video that every single person sees in the world, theoretically, at this point, which couldn't exist prior to that. And they could be live for like something like this could be done all over the world. Again, not technically feasible, but theoretically possible, or the idea exists. And so this really breaks down the structure of that pyramid when it comes to communication. You can see, and this happened, Regulus entered Virgo just months before the end of that window. And so we're in a new paradigm where those in power on top and the global special interest no longer have control over information. Okay, and this has become readily clear over the last decade. Okay. It's just a nice little meme. I like this one. In a lot of ways, this is exactly what the media has become. It's like this is you turn on the news or something, and it's really just, instead of telling you just objectively what is, it comes with emotionally how you're supposed to feel about it, and that's really where we're at. Just a quick rundown. I'm not going to get into all of it. You can do your own deep dive, but in 1921, if you're not familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations, um, this is an entity that came into being in response to communication issues. And what happened was, at the end of World War I, there was supposed to be the creation of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was supposed to be this powerful, essentially global superpower, essentially like the top of the pyramid, right? And it never went through in the US because there were certain senators that were able to communicate to their constituents and learn about what it really meant and what its true intentions were, and they didn't want to have it, and so it was voted down. And what happened was the people that had all the money, Rockefellers and whatnot, they said, let's create this organization, Council on Foreign Relations. And that was in 1921. Following that, and then in part of that was there was purchase of like Time Magazine and other media outlets to get control of the message a little bit better, so that people would be more sympathetic to the idea of a League of Nations in the future. And so then, of course, World War II happened, and you could argue that World War I was created by the special interest bankers for the purpose of the creation of a peace, a group for peace like the League of Nations. And then you can say the United Nations was then the second try at that. Only this one was successful. And so in 1945, United Nations, and out of United Nations, you get the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of entities that roll out of the United Nations, which is supposed to be, on paper anyway, about peace and order in the world. When you really look into it, this is like the epitome of Regulus in Leo. This is like the ultimate empire, if you think of it, right? This is the ultimate empire. What Rome only wished they could do was have control, top-down control of the entire world, and make people think that it's about peace, for example. And if going back to the idea that Trump, for example, was his energy represents this transition, right? And what are the things he's doing? They're not very popular, but things like not being afraid to speak up at the World Economic Forum about defending the United States as an individual sovereign nation, defunding the World Health Organization, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord over here in the climate change stuff. All treaties that sound good on paper, all entities that sound good on paper, but maybe they're not, and maybe he's not doing it for the right reasons. But the idea is there's action being taken to dismantle the U.S.'s involvement in these Regulus in Leo inspired empire organizations. And that's really having a ripple effect on the rest of the world. You have things like in Europe, you've got Brexit, and you've got other countries in Europe thinking about exiting the European Union. Again, European Union sounds good on paper, but is it really about peace or in order, or is it about control? But in any case, in terms of communication, in keeping that message clear, another thing that happened here was in the 1950s, Operation Mockingbird in the US. So this was not a conspiracy theory, definitely a documented conspiracy to put members of the CIA into media outlets and to kind of intermingle them, and so that there can be, the assurance of the correct message that wants to get out on a global scale. So you have Council on Foreign Relations and CIA. So now it's tough for the US to really get pure information. Also, in the 1980s, you had massive media consolidation. So I don't know if you've ever seen, but there used to be a lot more independent media. By the 1980s, it was pretty much down to about 5 or 6 companies that own all media. And so when that happens, it becomes a lot easier for these higher echelon parts of the pyramid to control messages, okay, and control what the people actually get to hear, and to frame anything that doesn't fit into it as something way out there in conspiracy theory and no need to look at it. But that in itself is manipulating your own mind, because you have your own eyes and ears to do research and to tell for yourself. In 1996, there was a Telecommunications Act in the US. Part of that was Section 230. This has a lot to do with the rapid development of the internet at that time. And so there was these platforms coming out like what are now Twitter, Facebook. These are platforms for information, kind of like AT&T or Sprint are platforms for phone communication. And so because these platforms can be used for illegal activities, this Section 230 basically helped protect these platforms from liability in the case of misuse of information using their platforms. And so because of that, they're not allowed to act as publishers. And this is why we'll talk in a couple slides here about the fact checkers and deleting accounts and sometimes not really having an explanation for it. That's an abuse of Section 230, because now they're platforms who aren't liable for illegal activity, but now they're acting as publishers, saying what's true and what's not true. And of course, they're obviously influenced by what's up on the upper echelons of those pyramids. And then now we have this Venus occultation that I just talked about, that window where now it's very hard to control communication after that happened. And obviously in the last 8 years it's just gotten more and more rapidly out of control, which isn't a bad thing for the average person, but it's a horrible thing if you're at the top of the pyramid and you're trying to keep messages under control. And it's a big part of the reason why Hillary did not win in 2016, is because communication got out of control. And there was just too much going out there about every individual, including Hillary Clinton. So they can't hide things. And people were making their own decisions about what they believed to be true or not. And you're allowed to do that as a sovereign human being, to make your own decisions. And when we got to 2012, there was the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. So that originally the Smith-Mundt Act was in 1948, and it was about preventing propaganda specifically. And in that modernization in 2012, it basically loosened up the criteria so that if propaganda was now in some forms okay and not against the law. And that's exactly what's happened, is to counter this Venus occultation, is they had to now create ways to be able to put out information in other ways, right? Because if it's all just factual, then it's going to be hard to direct public opinion. And that's exactly what the point of that was. And then in 2016, the Portman-Murphy counter-propaganda bill, this has to do with foreign propaganda. So what happens starting in 2016, all we hear about is Russia, 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 right? Because if something happened that is illicit activity and someone higher up can defer it and blame it on Russian interference, now we're just following this counter propaganda bill, right? We got to look into it because it might be Russian propaganda. We're seeing that with the Hunter Biden laptop as we speak, right? Is this whole idea of, oh, it's Russian, that's Russian propaganda. And it's we know that just the FBI director has already said that it's not true. But the idea is they can throw that out there. So big tech, again, this Facebook, Google, YouTube, they had to kind of tighten the grips on things because they were both simultaneously the source of this free flow of information, but also, now they've got to find ways to hold it in place. But again, it's not working because Regulus in Leo is falling apart. So as soon as Regulus entered Virgo, and this occultation was done, they've had to make rapid changes to how they manage information because there's just too much out there flying around out of control. And again, that's part of, not all of it's true, of course, but a good deal of it is. And a lot of people are being able to use their own brains to figure out what is and what isn't. Fact checkers, for example, like if you look into that, who funds them, we're talking about upper echelons of these pyramids, again, funding these fact checkers for specific results. They're not really objective, okay? And so it's essentially globalist special interests, those still clinging to whatever's left in that cell phone for Regulus and Leo energy, and it's breaking down fast. And Trump, again, being an entity that represents the transition, is in their way, for all intents and purposes, in their way. Is that in our way? Not necessarily, but it is in their way for sure, which is why he is not looked at too kindly in the media that they own. This is important to realize. A society whose citizens refuse to see and investigate the facts who refuse to believe that their government and their media will routinely lie to them and fabricate a reality contrary to verifiable facts, is a society that chooses and destroys a police state dictatorship. Okay, I don't think we're going to get there, but the idea is there is a lot of gaslighting via the media, lots of gaslighting, because there can be, true stories that emerge and they just get buried and they just don't come through, and they just ignore them. And that's because they don't want to lose their jobs. It's all about compartmentalization. If you work in the media and you're told don't cover the story, you're not going to cover that story, and that's what it comes down to. In the media, this is Malcolm X quote, and he's absolutely right. He said this in the 1960s. He's still right. It's the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent, and they control the minds of the masses. And that's just very true, at least, and it's always been true, especially right up until about the last 8 years or so, when we've been on the other side of Regulus, now in Virgo, in the other side of that Venus occultation, which is why, again, you had to have modernization to propaganda acts to move through. And so, like, just an example, I mentioned Time Magazine specifically. It was one of the many entities bought by special interest groups, global special interest. This is the first cover ever that doesn't have the word time on it. And this is the one coming up. And, you could say, yeah, it's got some red and blue in it. But what I see here is where the global special interests are invested, which is the blue. They're telling you to vote blue, basically, right? It says vote right there, and it's blue. That's their special interest, because Trump is in their way, and for all intents and purposes. You can love him or hate him, but he is certainly in the way of globalist special interest. And of course, they prefer any puppet they can throw in there for to get Trump out. And because this time frame is very important, and ultimately it really doesn't matter. Like I said, it's not even like Trump was really a Republican. He's not even a politician. He's just someone in the way of the plans of two entities that have essentially been controlled from the top down from those global special interests. One just dresses themselves differently than the other. And this was true. The transition, I mean, you can't deny it, the transition from, say, the George W. Bush regime, which was, definitely obviously run by those global special interests, where we were going through regime changes on a regular basis in other countries for the purpose of bringing freedom, quote unquote. And even though there was promises that peace is coming and hope is coming in 2008, the bombs kept coming, almost as if it didn't skip a beat. There was no transition in foreign policy from Bush to Obama whatsoever. It was dressed up differently, like we said, but there was no transition. And I think that's a big part of why Trump won in 2016. There were a lot of voters who voted for Obama in 2008 who voted for Trump in 2016, because it wasn't about Democrat Republican anymore. It was about what Trump terms the deep state or the swamp or whatever. But it does exist. I mean, there are global special interests, again, in this pyramidal structure, that are dying, and they're desperate as we speak. And here's a good quote from Bill Hicks, a great comedian. The problem isn't a lack of money, food, water, or land. The problem is that you're giving control of these things to a group of greedy psychopaths who care more about maintaining their own power than helping mankind. And whichever party you're talking about, it's true, or has been. This is a great little look at a pyramid structure of where we sit in the bottom here in debt and whatnot, and the institutions that we get our information from, our education, media, the governments that set our rules and whatnot. That's all in the bottom of the pyramid. But the control of that media, control of that education, control of that government, that comes from these, the world's financial controls and these think tanks, United Nations being one of them, Trilateral Commission, Bilderbergs. I'm not going to get into those, but and on top of that are the ultimate special interest groups, the families, the world's richest families, and their control over those think tanks, which control the finances, which control the corporations, which control the government's education and media. And they like to split us up into right versus left, where we're either blaming corporations and begging for more government, or we're blaming government and basically assuming that if we just get the government out of the way, that we're not going to be taxed to death as independent small businesses by these same special interests. It's just until this structure breaks down, which it is in the process of, that right-left paradigm can still exist. But that's really what's falling apart. This, if you're not familiar, remember Pluto in Capricorn, currently 2008 to 2024, it's a 16-year period. That's 8 years under Obama, and it would have been 8 years under Clinton. And if you look at just kind of this almost looks as it was a plan in the beginning, but it looks like a resume now, as far as what happened under Obama. I think you can make the argument that Clinton was supposed to win in 2008, but because Barack Obama was more popular, they went with Plan B. Okay, in my opinion, he was compromised. Blackmail and bribery is the classic ways that people are compromised, and he was used for special interests. It's why nothing changed in terms of foreign policy after Bush. He spoke all kinds of game against Monsanto in 2007, 2008. It's why I voted for him in 2008. And he, at the very end of his presidency, he actually hired someone from Monsanto as like the head of, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was someone you wouldn't want in that position. Being someone from Monsanto who was supposed to be ultimately hated and whatnot. So he was not operating, in my opinion, of his own accord. He was certainly being used, whereas Clinton was, on board from the beginning and wanted to be president in 2008, said, okay, I'll wait. 2016, then what happens? You can put, big picture of President Trump right in the middle there to prevent the rest of what would have happened. And then you add in what Trump has done the last 4 years, which is just a slap in the face, a huge slap in the face to what these global special interests wanted to do, which was really weaken America to the point where essentially the UN was our only resort, right? And that would strengthen communist China, again, amplifying another Regulus and Leo kind of entity, communism. And Trump has been nothing but against both of those things. He's all about reviving America and weakening China. So two things that the global special interests do not want. So from their perspective, they want him out for sure. And we as individuals can make our own decisions what we think is best. It ultimately doesn't matter. Like we said, the parties don't make a difference, but he's certainly screwing up their plans and making it harder. 99% of us want good-hearted people, or are good-hearted people, respect others and want peace. And there's just the rest of them on the top of that pyramid. But when that pyramid flattens, that changes things. And I don't know, there we go. Okay. There's a couple of other slides here that, I guess it just wants me to go there. Whatever. Anyway, so like I said, we can't think of the old system anymore. We really have to, build a new model, essentially. Buckminster Fuller has a great quote here about getting rid of the existing model, because that's really what's become obsolete. Okay, the same systems that are crumbling are also being called to crumble in each of us, though, individually. And that's really what the important part is. It's not about who we're letting rule us, but how we're owning our sovereign authority in the first place. And this is a great quote from Krishnamurti. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's from India. He's just talking about this. There is no political solution. There's no leader who's ever going to give us peace, okay, or bring about peace in the world, to stop all wars. It's all about us. It's all about that revolution inside, okay. And it's he's even mentioning the United Nations in here too, like basically talking about how we can't just create a new League of Nations or United Nations and so on to bring peace. It isn't going to happen. To rely on others or the outside entities, those hierarchical structures, isn't going to bring us peace. And this goes back to the whole idea of, let peace begin with me, essentially, right? And freedom is our birthright, and we have the power to choose peace with that freedom. And it's our ability to cooperate with others and bring peace into situations, and it starts being accountable for our own mental and emotional well-being. And this is exactly what the modern media is designed to do, is to prevent this, to prevent going within and thinking about things ourselves and thinking about how we feel about them ourselves. It's designed to basically jump the gun and put us in an emotional state of reaction. And we don't even know what we think. And that's why even when you can get facts, it doesn't change people's minds sometimes, even if the facts are in front of their face, if they feel strongly about a cause that they were convinced of via the media, right? So this operates in all ways. And when we know and accept our internal disagreements, because we have them, that's part of what I do with astrology. When I work with clients, is helping an individual understand their own internal struggle, their own internal um, tug of war, and how to balance that, because that's what brings the healing, and that's what prevents the projection of the unhealed parts of ourselves. Okay, and in disagreement is always going to exist, and it's really something we have to accept. To be free, we actually have to disagree. You can't be completely free if all of your interactions are based on agreement. Then you're not going to be completely free, because you're never going to completely agree with everything on every point. And again, the way our media is structured, the way our politics is structured, is in a very either or. You either with us or you're against us. And it's just not true. There's a lot more nuance in reality. And as this power structure falls apart and we get into more of a Regulus and Virgo expression, that's exactly what it is. It's a respect for each individual perspective, not just what we're taught from the top down. So how can we create a properly scaled, conscious, and peaceful communities that are sustainable, balancing all aspects? It's not going to happen with the old way, picking the elephant or the donkey. It's just not going to be the way it is. We've got to start thinking like Krishnamurti had said. It starts within. Freedom and peace on all levels starts from within. So creating cooperative and sustainable communities, it requires intentional peace with an acceptance and understanding of disagreements. So we're not going to say, oh, you disagree with me here, you're not allowed in our space. It's all about accepting diversity of opinion, not just superficial diversity, but diversity of opinion. Okay. So sovereign union requires the healing and integration of the shadow. And the shadow is something that is, shadow is something that is brought on. If you look down here, it's brought on a lot because of these Regulus and Leo structures, collectivism, again, the statism in general, whether it's communism or fascism, or even our current structure of statism, where there's a little too much government dictation, etc. So scale does matter, and the smaller our scales of our communities are, the better they work. The better they work practically in terms of energy and everything else, but they're also in terms of peace as well. So connection consciousness plus the technology we have today, that's what equals a big paradigm shift. And so we have that huge advance in connection technology from the last Venus occultation that was over in 2012. So we're on the other side of that. And so knowing that we have the capability to connect with each other, which is, one of the things we got out of, I guess, this coronavirus thing, was how we can still connect, right? And it's like, whatever your opinions are on the whole situation, either way, we come out with it knowing that, we don't have to be in each other's spaces to still, have commerce and economy moving and everything else, and to actually connect with each other one-on-one. And just remember the formation of the USA, we had Pluto and Capricorn, and we did that at a time when Regulus was in Leo. Again, this time when Pluto comes back to where it was, we have Regulus in Virgo. So there's more of a chance for us to do things differently. And that's another part of the reason why, even though those three outer planets, those three evolutionary planets, Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, they're all changing signs here in the middle of this decade coming up. And they're all doing what they were doing at, say, the American Revolution, the World War II, and the Civil War. And it's not, we don't have to expect the same results, because especially with the power structure shift from Regulus in Leo to Virgo, we're in a different state of mind, or a different state of being. And so Regulus in Leo is that globalist special interest, those collective forms of governance. And just understand that externalities like pollution, for example, it's the larger the entities get, the larger they get, is the more pollution, it becomes unmanageable. And so, pollution becomes much more manageable at a smaller scale. And that's really the direction things are heading with Regulus in Virgo, is, much more local, rather than a separation consciousness kind of being. And we're still connected because of technology. That's the beauty of it, is you're not isolating yourself from the world. You're just allowing for more local governance and whatnot. So back to this slide that we had in the beginning again. So we're saying goodbye to the hierarchy, goodbye to needing a guru or a leader. balancing masculine and feminine, our own inner authority with our inner child, so we're not exporting our authority, and we're moving from codependence to sovereignty. And then, conscious liberty includes, all these aspects. So for example, in government, just say, for example, we have a House of Representatives. It's like 500 and something seats. I don't even know what it is. Each state has a different amount. What we've learned with the coronavirus is you don't need to be present, right? Why aren't representatives of certain districts living in their district? This is one of the big problems that Joe Collins, that individual I brought up, who's running for a district rep in LA, who's running up against Maxine Waters. One of his biggest gripes with her is that she lives in a mansion not in their district. So there's a person that lives in a mansion not in the district that district she represents, and that district is not a wealthy district. And so what is she doing for the district, right? And so what if a very simple change that wouldn't even be a major problem that could be done literally overnight is you send all their House of Representatives home to their districts and you work from home. And maybe there's, quarterly meetings or something in DC, but think of what that would do for eliminating opportunities for lobbyists, right? You can't ask a group of 12 to 15 representatives out to lunch, right, at one time. You can't do those kind of things when they're all separate, when they're all sovereign entities instead of become one entity, one kind of, corrupt, potentially corruptible entity, the House of Representatives. And the same thing can be said of the Senate, living in the capital city of your state, for example. These are small little things, but there's other things that can be done as well, as far as voting goes and whatnot. In education, the education system's been massively infiltrated by global special interests and whatnot, and it's created a monster. Same with the media. And so there's, more independence in media, more independence in education would help increase diversity and diversity of opinion, etc. So long as things are based on facts, you're going to have different perspectives that come out of that instead of one mono perspective, which is the intent of everything. Medicine, we talked about that, transitioning from kind of looking at each individual as like a machine with parts, no different from each other, putting them down the assembly line for treatment, and instead treating people individually and holistically. That's going to be that. Power distribution. Again, we have massive power grids that if they go down, there's lots of people affected. We can easily tone that down to smaller local sizes, and that will open up the opportunity for renewable energies that can't really operate on the larger scales, but can operate on smaller scales. Local agriculture, improvements with that, or even doing things in urban kind of agriculture, and then and so on and so forth. We don't have to go through everything, but the idea being is that we are in this major transition, and if we look at the big picture of it, we can understand it. And what is this? Just to give an example of this idea of conscious liberty or sovereign harmony, what I like to call it, is I'm sure it's hard to figure out what this is, or if you've seen this before. What this is actually, this was a research in Minnesota where they followed some wolf packs around. And it's just interesting how this wolf pack won't leave its territory. This wolf pack won't leave its territory. They basically establish territories and they respect them. And so it's like this kind of good fences make good neighbors kind of way of nature with wolves, essentially. So their packs, respect each other's territory. So you can kind of think of this as like, this could be all one entity under one rule, and the wolves are just fighting each other for resources, but they've decided to go, no, this is ours, that's yours, this is ours, and maybe they communicate on the edges here, but for the most part, they're not on the internet communicating with each other like we can be. But just an example in nature of this idea of conscious liberty and sovereign harmony. So having sovereign, in this case, you have sovereign packs, right? And so even this idea of a nation is almost too big in some ways, and just reducing things to manageable size is the way to go. So what is coming up for 2021? So we did a little preview of kind of the mid 2020s and what's happening with the shift there. We have some big things happening. Jupiter is going to be, like I said before, Jupiter and Saturn are going to join each other and cross over the threshold from Capricorn into Aquarius. Then Jupiter is going to make a square to Uranus and Taurus in January, followed by Saturn right behind Jupiter. It's going to make that same square. It's going to last a little longer. So the entire year of 2021 is going to be under either Jupiter square Uranus or Saturn square Uranus. and Uranus, I should say, and Jupiter and Saturn are going to be in Aquarius when that happens. Uranus in Taurus. So what this can mean is, because Uranus has a lot to do with technology advances and whatnot. I really feel like something is going to just kind of shift very quickly here when we end the year. The winter solstice here, December 21st, 2020, when Jupiter and Saturn join each other at 0 degrees Aquarius, it's almost like the threshold of what we call the age of Aquarius. These two major planets connecting, and then we're going to have Pluto follow that into Aquarius in 2024, right? And so these next several years, think of 2021 as setting that up, right? And that Aquarian age is a much more technological age. We don't want to get into the technocracy, and if you don't know what that is, that's more of the globalist special interest use of technology to control humanity. This is more of the use of humanity's use of technology to improve life and connection and connectivity, like we talked about just a couple slides ago. So there could be some major developments that kind of change the playing field for the years to come. And it could very well have to do with advances in medical technology, advances in, again, energy technology, whatever it is. There's a strong potential in 2021 that we're going to really be able to advance rapidly, but it's going to take some adjustment. And that's what that square to Uranus is, because Uranus and Taurus is all about Taurus, I should say, is all about comfort and being safe and comfortable, and Uranus is kind of rattling that up a little bit. And so how this changes the global financial situation is going to be up for grabs as well. It's like, imagine if there were major medical advances, for example, right? That could change the entire global medical system, right? And so that is a huge jolt to finances relative to medicine, right? If there's stocks in now irrelevant medicines or methods, suddenly there can be big falls and there could be big rises in other ones. So look for some technologically driven volatility in the market is what I would say for 2021. But that can be ultimately a positive thing if we're looking to move beyond the old paradigm, right? And then we'll move on there. But for example, when it comes to like alternative energies, free energies that are based on scalar technologies, there's lots of examples. They're very suppressed at this point and have been. If you're familiar with Nikola Tesla, the Tesla Tower up here, that's just one example of suppressed technologies that haven't been able to move out. And if they were, that would be a huge hit to the global financial structure in terms of medicine and in terms of energy, because of the implications it would have on everything. And so these are some examples of some organizations creating that. Here's an actual picture from Milford, Texas from a few years ago. This is apparently a Tesla tower that went up, and people started noticing it and asking questions like, what is this? And there's still question marks about what's going on there. Are they experimenting? Is it, how are we doing this? And they essentially work by using ambient energy that's already around. And so you're not pulling from any resource essentially. And so it's infinite energy theoretically. And apparently it worked pretty well in 1943 when Tesla was finishing up, and there's been other examples of it working well. Here's just some other examples. It's using magnets, electromagnetic flows to help move generators and whatnot and create that electricity, create that energy. So we have examples in India and the US and Iran and really lots of different places. And what's really interesting, going back to the idea of Donald Trump representing the transition with his energy and especially the timing in 2016 when his progressed sun crossed over his ascendant at 29 degrees Leo, essentially representing that transition from Regulus and Leo, Regulus and Virgo. So the breakdown of the hierarchy and all the global special interests. If you're not familiar with who that is, that's actually Uncle John Trump, Trump's uncle. And I don't know what to make of it completely, but it's just worth noting. When Nikola Tesla died in 1943, this is the guy, he was a professor that was asked by the FBI to examine Tesla's papers and equipment. So this was literally the point person for going over the viability of Tesla's technologies. Where to take that? It's up to you. I'm not really sure what to make of it completely, but we do currently have someone in office that represents that transition energy, and we have this potential coming up in 2021 for rapid development potentially in those kind of energies. And then you have this connection. I don't know, could be a coincidence. So we won't get too much into it, but it's just worth noting. I don't know. What stands in the way of a global special interest is essentially, I mean, that any kind of scalar technology, scalar energy technology is just huge, just gonna change the game plan, because it's the control of oil resources and fossil fuels, and control over the narrative of climate change and everything that comes with that. Because if you bring in scalar energy, you take away not only the control of us using fossil fuels, but also that narrative of climate change goes away. And there's no way to control people with that anymore either, if we're not emitting any carbon dioxide anymore, right? So it's a major 1-2 punch. So it's really something that they're not going to let go lightly. So it's going to take a major transition, which is like what we're in. And this is a great quote that's very similar to another one that I like. There's simply no polite way to tell people they've dedicated their lives to an illusion. And it's a lot like the quote by Mark Twain, which is something like, it's easier to fool someone than it is to convince someone that they've been fooled. So it's easier to fool someone than to convince someone that they have been fooled. And that's similar to what the sentiment is here. Here's another one to leave it at. If you think you need a leader or religion, then you are not conscious, period. Being conscious means that you are capable of thinking independently and no longer need to be guided. In other words, sovereign, okay, sovereign authority, and seeing what's in front of your face and not allowing yourself to be gaslighted by a media entity that says, no, that's not true. Or, a fact check, that's not true. Blah, blah, blah. Even though, when you break it down, it actually is. Conscious people don't need to be told what to believe because their logic and reason allows them the ability to use their own minds. And that's, sometimes it takes a period of being gaslighted by these entities and the fact checkers and whatnot to really double down on your own confidence in your ability to use logic and reason. And that leads us to the end here. When all of the lights, if you think of every individual sovereign being, are shining their brightest, all the shadows disappear. And that sovereign generation of power. You think about candles, it only takes one flame to light them all. And then they're all independent lights at that point. So not dependent on each other. And at that point, there's no need for collectivism and all the shadows that come with it. So there's no need to say, oh, we're going to save everybody with this, just put me in power and then I'll take care of you kind of energy, which is, right now it's a desperation mode right now for the globalist special interests in the US, especially. They're really have just a few years left to push through this the breakdown of the US and the inclusion in a more global top-down collectivist structure, or what would be called a new world order or world government, headed by the UN or some other entity that would oversee that. So they're still trying to push that through. But once you get to the other side of Pluto in Capricorn, so 2024, when it's out, I think energetically it's just kind of out of time. This Pluto in Capricorn period from 2008 to 2024 has been the opportunity for the global special interest to push things forward and move that plan. And they're all into esoteric things. They understand astrology. They understand timing. There's a reason that the coronavirus came out when Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto were conjunct in Capricorn. I mean, they know when is a good time for certain energies, but not to fear. Things are not getting worse; they're just getting uncovered, and that's really the key here. Is you can only cover the truth for so long. So we got to hold tight until we get to the other side. And to me, honestly, I mean, when it comes to this election, it honestly doesn't matter at the end, because this energy is going to win no matter what. If the global special interests get Trump out of office, then it's going to take longer and it might be a little bumpier, in my opinion, because we're going to, like I said, the energy is going to win in the end. So what is going to have to come in to now defeat that? Whereas just keeping Trump in is the easier, quicker path toward that. Not that I'm advocating going one way or the other. Like I said, it doesn't ultimately matter. But in my opinion, I don't know, like I like the easier way, the quicker way better myself, but I will, deal with whatever the reality is, like a big boy. Anyway, so that ends up to the end here. So that's my website, sovereignharmony.com. if you are interested in looking more deeply into your own charts, your own, your own look at the inner struggles or disagreements essentially within you, I'm happy to help, happy to work with you on your chart specifically. I also do charts between individuals, so couples or business partners, things like that. So feel free to call me or email me right there, or go right through my website if you want as well. You can get that contact information there. So with that, I am going to probably stop this. Um, if you have any questions whatsoever, I guess we can take like a minute here to look at. Oh, hi, how's it going, Jelly? Thanks for joining. So I got the chat box open for just about a minute if you want to ask a question or something. But other than that, this is going to be available. I'll put up my YouTube page. I'll post it on the actual Facebook invite event invite, so that you'll get flagged if you put yourself as attending or interested in attending. It's going to be there for you. You get flagged for it. But if you have any other questions, you can always just contact me directly too. So with that, looks like everybody's pretty quiet. So I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to stop it. Thanks a lot and have a good night. Feel free to share this with anyone you want. It'd be interesting to see how the election turns out next week. But we'll see. You will see how it goes. It won't, like I said, as far as these energies go, it ultimately doesn't matter. That's a smaller scale thing. Although this global special interest, they certainly have who they want to win that one. I think it's pretty obvious. But we'll see you later. Have a good night. Talk to you then.